Welcome back into our Talmid Shorts Series. I want to ask the question, what is temptation? You hear this word bantered about, you hear it thrown about all over the place, you hear great discussions about it, but no one ever really nails down what is temptation. Well, the scripture has something to say about that. In the book of Matthew, in chapter 26, and verse 41, the scripture says this. It says, keep watching and praying that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. This is probably the single most direct and simple statement on this issue of temptation. Here in the Gospel of Matthew, he says, keep watching and praying that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the weak is flesh. Let me say, but the flesh is weak. Look at this. Everybody that I know experiences temptation. You experience temptation. I've experienced temptation. And it does not stop just simply because you've made an intellectual decision. Temptation, you will stop. No. Temptation is something that is ongoing continuously in our lives. No matter how spiritual you are or how long you follow Jesus Christ, you have been tempted, and temptation will continue to attempt to take over your life. Sometimes this experience seems like a little faint whisper. And other times, it's this unbearable shout that's in your mind. It's screaming at you. Listen, regardless of how it sounds, you know just what temptation feels like. Everybody knows what temptation feels like. But if someone asks, could you define the term? I think that's where we get stuck. We all know the senses and the feeling of temptation, but we never really ever stopped to define what is this thing. How does it get its foot in the door in my life? How does it get its hook inside me? Okay, and many times successfully it pulls at me. How does that happen? Well, temptation is simply an enticement. It's an enticement to take a God-given desire beyond God-given boundaries. Did you hear what I just said? Temptation is simply an enticement, right, to take God-given desires beyond God-given boundaries. So that's the first thing you have to identify, is that temptation always works with something that's good. But what it wants to do is to take it one step further, right, beyond good. So it wants to take a God-given desire, and then it wants to take it beyond God-given boundaries. That's the reason why temptation is so successful. Because in your heart and in your mind, immediately you give it credit. And you give it credence because you know it's God-given. That's not your problem. The problem is when it wants to go beyond God-given boundaries. That's where temptation wins the battle. Now, I understand that many people reject this idea. I got that. I understand it. Refusing to believe that guilt-instilling allurements, okay, could be even remotely related to the Lord. But that's where the enemy does his best work. But think about it. In what ways are you most often tempted? In what ways? How about in the area of material possessions? Money? Things? How about intimacy? What about companionship? What about food? Well, these are all things that God not only created, but uses to bless his people with. The problem comes when we who still carry around that old programming, that old nature of our flesh, okay, takes those drives, those desires beyond the healthy limits that God has set for our lives. And this is where temptation wins its battle. For example, God created sex for enjoyment within a marriage relationship. God created that. However, when we take the divinely approved desire and it is corrupted by physical intimacy outside of marriage, then what the Creator designed for His purposes becomes ultimately a source of guilt and shame, and you know I'm speaking the truth. That is not what God intended. One of the enemy's top strategies is to distort God-given drive for his own vile purposes. Now you can shortcut, you can short circuit such an attack in your life. Listen, you have to remind yourself where this urge came from in the first place. And then you're going to have to ask God for the strength to use such drives for His glory as He intended. That's why He told us in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 41, keep watching and praying that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak.